Good morning. Buenos días a todos. We are here today at a panel on the unaccompanied immigrant minors crisis and Philadelphia. This is part of MOIMA's, or the Mayor's Office of Immigrant and Multicultural Affairs, second Multicultural Passport Week to Philadelphia. We are thrilled to be here today at Philly Camp and with great panelists. And I would like to really thank not only Philly Camp for hosting us today, but also our partners in this panel, Nationalities Service Center, represented here by Steve Larin, what's director of their legal services, HIAS-PA, and Steve will be with you. He will be moderating the panel discussion today. This is a subject that has garnered a lot of interest, not only nationally, but locally. And in our mission at MOIMA, we think that it's important to have a conversation that is informed. So today we have gathered a number of individuals with great expertise that will really not only illuminate and give us some facts about the issues related to this crisis in the United States, and will tell us how it affects Philadelphia. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Steve Larin, who will introduce the panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning and to participate, especially this day, September 15th. Today is Independence Day for El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. And it's the first day of Hispanic Heritage Month. And it's during this month that we have a time to talk about Latin American culture and their contributions to the United States. But it's also time to examine the relationship between the United States and Latin America. It's a time to recognize that the policies, politics, and economy of each country in the region can really impact its neighbors. The interconnectedness of the region and this relationship of policies is really exemplified in this issue that we're talking about today. It's exemplified in the plight of thousands of children from Central America who have escaped violence and poverty and are seeking protection throughout the region, not only in the United States, but there are record numbers of asylum applicants throughout the region in Central America and Mexico and in the US. Since October of last year, there's been more than 66,000 children traveling without a parent who have been detained by US border officials. That number nearly doubles the number from last year and is about 60,000 more than it was in 2009, where only 5,400 children were detained. Over the summer, many of us heard media reports and government officials talk about the humanitarian crisis that's presented at the border. The international community has also spoken out and done reports on this crisis. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees issued a report concluding that nearly 60% of the children have suffered or faced harms in their home country that merit or indicate a need for international protection. So we're all trying to figure out in what way and what role the US and our organizations and all of us have in assisting these children. Locally, from January to July of this year, over 30,000, well, in the country, over 30,000 children have now been released from those detention centers and placed with sponsors throughout the country. Locally in Pennsylvania, over 450 of the children have been placed with homes in Pennsylvania with families, friends, or other sponsors in Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, 147 children were placed during that period, and that number continues to grow as more children come in. So it's an issue that's impacting us locally and regionally. The children's needs we heard about in the media reports, we often heard about the crisis at the shelters, not enough bed space and overcrowding and lack of legal care, but those needs haven't ended with their being placed with families and sponsors. Those needs continue. We still need to find ways for the children to get care, to make sure that they're in safe homes, that the sponsors that they have know how to care for them. Many of the children have suffered various forms of trauma. And we still need to figure out ways to find legal representation so that they have a fair opportunity to present their case before immigration officials or judges. All of us here at the table have been working on different avenues and perspectives on addressing the issue, and everybody will speak to that shortly. The organization I work with, the Nationalities Service Center, recently began a Bienvenidos project for unaccompanied children, providing legal services and social services to the children and to their families and sponsors. Our panelists will talk a bit about what they do in their organizations and how they're addressing this issue, but also sort of give a bigger perspective of what's going on. I'm happy that we have such a wonderful panel, and I'm happy to introduce Elizabeth Yeager from HIAS, Pennsylvania, Mary Clark from Esperanza Immigration Legal Services, and Professor Machuca Galvez from Swathmore College. We'll begin with Elizabeth. She's a staff attorney with HIAS-PA, where she represents children in immigration court and before the Department of Homeland Security. She's worked representing detained non-citizens and representing torture survivors, those that are mentally ill, and other vulnerable groups in these proceedings. She's going to provide us some of the background so we can understand the process that the children go through when they're detained at the border, and then what possibilities they have for any sort of legal, lawful status in the United States. Liz?
All right. Thank you, Stephen. So first off, I just want to give a little bit more information about exactly what we do at HIAS, so you can kind of see how we fit into the picture. HIAS Pennsylvania is a nonprofit organization that provides legal services for immigrants and refugees, and also resettlement services for refugees coming into the United States through the legal resettlement process. Our work with unaccompanied minors falls under our legal services work. In our legal department, we do a lot of legal services for immigrants and refugees of all backgrounds, and this is one particular project that we have, our Immigrant Youth Advocacy Project, which has been around for going on about 10 years. Through this project, we've always provided legal assistance to children and young people living in Philadelphia and in the Philadelphia region. There's always been a portion of those children that we served that have been children who have recently arrived in the United States, have been detained by immigration authorities, and then later ended up in Pennsylvania, are in removal proceedings or deportation proceedings in immigration court, and need help fighting their case. Over the past couple of years, we've seen that number of cases that we handle increase and increase and increase to the point where this year, as Stephen said, there's been more than 60,000 children, nationwide crossing the border, entering our country and being detained by immigration authorities, and a big number of those have ended up in Pennsylvania. So we are just one of the legal services agencies that's now being receiving this kind of onslaught of legal requests from children and families who are here who need help because they're actually in deportation proceedings and they're trying to find a way to fight their case to see if they can stay. But so I just want to talk a little bit, and so also to break down the actual work that we do with these children. Number one, we're providing direct legal representation to children living in the area. This past year, we also got involved in the work of providing some limited legal services to children who are living in shelters in Pennsylvania under the custody of the federal government, most of whom are there for a short time while they're awaiting being released to family members or other adults. And through this work, we've, in the past year alone, interviewed more than 600, probably going on 700 children by now in Pennsylvania. And during that process, we've had the chance to ask them about, who you are, where you're from, why did you come to the United States, for our purposes to see if they may be eligible for some kind of legal relief. And by and large, what we're hearing from these children is that many of them are fleeing very dire situations at home, mainly in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We hear all the time stories of trauma and abuse, gang violence, fear of gang violence, whether someone personally might have been subjected to it or members of their family. We've heard, particularly among girls and young women, teenage girls, high instances of sexual violence, both while they were living in their home countries and during their journey into the United States. And some horrific stories of things that have happened to children who have been trying to make their way to the United States, which to us indicates just how desperate people are to flee these very desperate situations back home. So how is it that these children end up here in Pennsylvania, and how is it that it becomes an issue for our community? Well, as Stephen said, many of these children entering the United States end up placed with the word that the government uses, sponsors, so a relative or someone who can care for them. And how is that and why is that? So under the law, children are afforded certain protections, fortunately, that are not necessarily available to adults. In particular, when an adult is detained entering the country, crossing the border, oftentimes they're subjected to a swift deportation, or or during the time that they're in the United States, they're detained by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or CBP, Customs and Border Patrol. With children, the government is under an obligation to transfer them as quickly as possible out of the hands of ICE, which is the immigration agency that's charged with detaining and deporting people, and into the hands of a different federal agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR. ORR is the same agency that brings in refugees from overseas and provides social services and helps people, get started on their life in the United States. So it was decided after much litigation by advocates for children and immigrants' rights back 10, 15, 20 years ago, that responsibility should lie not with ICE, but with this different federal agency. So if a child's detained entering the border, we see these pictures on the news of kids behind these cells crowded into this border facility. Children are detained there, and within 72 hours, the government has to send them into ORR custody. And so ORR runs this network of shelters across the United States. There's a handful of them that have started operating in Pennsylvania in the past year. And these shelters are more akin to, say, a group home where a child who's involved in the child welfare system in Philadelphia might end up living for a time. Usually they spend 2 to 3 weeks, maybe about a month, maybe less, in one of these shelters. And it's the job of the staff there to see to it that these children are sent to live in the least restrictive setting possible that's appropriate for them. And so usually what ends up happening is the social workers at these shelters meet with the children. They identify any relatives that might be here in the United States, whether it's a parent or an aunt or an uncle or another older adult relative who can care for the child and provide for them. And so most of these children end up being in the shelter for a short time, then leaving and living wherever it is may be that they may have somebody. And so we see plenty of children in Philadelphia and in the surrounding counties who've come to the US as unaccompanied children, have a relative here in our communities, and are then sent to live with them. So when a child in this situation is, sent by ORR to live with a family in a safe home, that's not the end of the story, obviously. There's plenty of needs, as Stephen said, that must be met for them once they are living in our communities. And certainly not least of those is the need for legal services, because they're not simply given a place to live, they're also given a notice to appear in immigration court and a hearing date, and they have to show up, and they're not given a lawyer by the government. There's no public defenders in the immigration system, even for kids. We've been to court, I've been to court. I was in court last week, and after my hearings had gone through, I stayed and I sat and I watched the hearings of people who didn't have lawyers yet. And there were 3 or 4 people, teenage-aged kids sitting there, and then there was a woman holding a 2-year-old in her arms, and that 2-year-old was in deportation proceedings, not the adult that was with the 2-year-old, this 2-year-old girl. So what happens when you're in immigration court, when you're in deportation proceedings? The question there's a judge who's going to decide whether this person has to be deported from the United States or whether they're entitled to some relief or some protection under our laws that would entitle them to win their case in court, meaning, be able to live permanently in the United States. And there are certain protections under the law that can be available to many of these children. In fact, Stephen mentioned that when the UN published their study, they found that at least 60% of the children that they interviewed had potential claims for legal relief. I think that in the work that we do, we see that about mirrored in the children that we interview. Certainly more than half of them, maybe around 60%, maybe more than that, potentially could qualify for relief under the law to stay in the United States and be protected here rather than be sent back to the country that they have fled. So what are those things exactly? Some of these are laws that exist that could protect children or adults. For example, asylum, someone who's fleeing persecution in their home country. If they've personally been targeted or have a serious fear of persecution, were they to return, they could present their claim for asylum and ask for protection. Also, there are special visas called U visas and T visas, which protect people who have been the victims of serious crime or the victims of human trafficking if they're in the United States because someone brought them here. In the case of a child, trying to exploit them. We've seen cases of sex trafficking where thankfully law enforcement got involved and the child was able to escape and be protected and seek help. They can apply for legal status on that basis so that they don't have to be sent back into harm's way. And the last and possibly biggest thing that we see is something that applies to children specifically, which is called special immigrant juvenile status. And that's a special protection under our law for children who have been subjected to abuse or neglect or abandonment by their parents or by one of their parents, and for whom it would not be in their best interest to return to their home country. And if a family court judge here in the United States makes that determination, then that child is eligible to apply for this special visa and for permanent resident status in the United States. So these are all things that, you know, it's important to think about just kind of when we're thinking about this stuff. You know, this is somebody who's in the US who's obviously undocumented. They've crossed the border without papers. In fact, they're in deportation proceedings. But these are protections under a law that are specifically there to assist vulnerable people, you know, regardless of how it is that they entered the United States, when it is that they entered the United States, whether they've been detained. And so, you know, like I said, we've seen certainly a good number of the children that we interview are potentially eligible for one, if not more, of these forms of legal relief. What we're constantly trying to do is figure out how can we get the most services and the most help to as many children as we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. And I'll just add in the conversation about the need for legal representation that a recent study indicates that of unaccompanied children who were not represented by an attorney at their immigration court proceedings, 90% received a final order of removal. Those that were represented, about 50% were granted lawful status in the US. The likelihood is that those that had orders of removal probably also had good claims, similar claims. It's the same group of children that we're talking about. And so the value of that legal representation is critical. And it's a big call that we make when we come out and talk about the need for assistance in providing legal services. Mary Clark is the Executive Director of Esperanza Immigration and Legal Services, and she'll speak to us about some of the services they're providing for unaccompanied children, but also she'll widen the lens a little bit and talk to us about a recent trip that Reverend Luis Cortez from Esperanza made to Central America at the request of the White House, and give us a view a bit of what people are saying in Central America. He went to Honduras and Guatemala and talked to us a bit about that trip. Mary?
Thank you, Stephen. So I work at Esperanza Immigration Legal Services, which is a small nonprofit in North Philadelphia. We provide immigration services primarily, or historically, we've provided citizenship, family petitions, fairly straightforward cases. We are, like I said, we're very small. I'm the only attorney, and we've only been around for about 5 years. But in the last couple months or so, we've seen an overwhelming need, an overwhelming request for assistance with this type of case. So we have actually started, but I would say, you know, compared to Nationalities Service Center and HIAS, our capacity to take on these cases is much, much smaller. We work primarily with the Hispanic community. We're located in a Hispanic neighborhood, and we're a subsidiary organization of Esperanza, which is a faith-based Hispanic organization that does both national and local community development work. They also do advocacy work, and the director of Esperanza, Reverend Luis Cortez, who is a Baptist minister, he, at the request of the White House, he made a trip with a number of Hispanic faith leaders to Guatemala and Honduras. Last month, they took a trip, and they met with both officials from the US government, officials from the local governments, and local community leaders, both faith-based and non-faith-based, to sort of talk about, you know, what is going on the ground and how can churches in the United States assist with some of the issues that are going on and some of the root causes of why these children are coming over in such large numbers. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm not at liberty to talk about all of the suggestions that they made going forward, because it's still a confidential report, but to talk about some of both the issues they saw on the ground, but opportunities they saw for making some difference. So, like I said, they went to just Honduras and Guatemala, and some of the issues they saw were really across the board. Everyone really identified similar key issues. And in order of what folks saw as the biggest reason for children coming over, the first one was obviously, I'm sure everyone's heard, the rampant gang violence and crime, whether related to drug-related violence or just actual gangs charging taxes to individuals and to agencies to be able to live in these towns. They saw that more so in Honduras than Guatemala, but definitely in both places. I'm sure many of you have heard Honduras has the highest homicide rate in the world, and there have been statistics about just how high the crime rates are in those countries. Another issue that folks identified was extreme poverty. 30% of Hondurans live on less than $2 a day, according to the World Bank. But I would be careful with that one because Nicaragua is one of the poorest countries in Central America, and yet has very few child migrants. So I think it's not just the extreme poverty. I think some in the press have said, these children are coming over because they want, better economic opportunities in the United States, and it's not just that. There's a lot of different issues at play. Another issue that they identified was a lack of a secondary school system, and this is something that I've seen with clients who've come into our office. A lot of the individuals are around 11, 12 years old, and they either don't have a secondary school system that they can go to, or it's a school that is so far away that they either have to go into a town which has a lot of drug and gang violence, or they have to walk, hours to get to a place where there is a school. And so a lot of these kids or family members are sending these kids because there's not school opportunities. In addition to that, or connected to that, would be lack of jobs, economic opportunities. The reality is a lot of these kids, there's no schools, but then there's also no jobs for them to enter into when they do turn the age where they would be going to school, and there's not schools there. And so often many individuals turn to gangs in order to be able to survive. Other issues that they identified, as Liz mentioned, domestic violence is a big issue, especially for females and for young women. And then lower down the list was reuniting with family members in the United States. And I know that in the UNHCR report, they identified that that was never the sole reason that individuals who said that they were coming to the United States to reunite with family members, it was that in connection with one of the other factors as a reason for coming to the United States. So some of the opportunities that they saw when they went down there was actually, obviously, it was a faith-based group, and so they were talking to a lot of the churches and a lot of the pastors. But something that I found interesting was that, especially in Honduras, the churches were at a point where they were fairly organized. They were looking at primarily evangelical churches because Esperanza is an evangelical faith-based organization, but that the churches were fairly organized and ready to work on community development issues in the country. In Guatemala, a little less so. But as the delegation was there, they were told by a number of community members that the church was one of the few organizations that was allowed to function in the, at certain hours. There was like a curfew, and so agencies were not allowed to remain open after, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that the churches were one place where there was a certain amount of respect there, or maybe not respect, but just allowing them to have their service. And so the delegation saw it as a real opportunity to work in these communities with the churches, given that they are able to do their work, whereas other organizations weren't necessarily allowed to do that. And they also they heard stories of individuals who said that they were actually allowed to leave the gangs in their countries if their reason for leaving the gangs was to convert to Christianity. But there was actually some amount of monitoring by the gangs to ensure that they actually stayed with the church, and if they didn't, there were repercussions if they didn't actually stay and commit, if their conversion to Christianity wasn't genuine. So the delegation, some of their proposals involved working really closely with the churches in working with these kids to provide more opportunities for them, and obviously working on getting more funding to fund schools and secondary schools in those countries. So that's what Esperanza, our parent organization, is doing, and obviously hoping to spread the word about how we in the U.S. can assist with some of the community development issues in those countries, to see if we can help some of the root causes of why these kids are coming over.
Thank you, Mary. I just want to add as well to that part of the reason we're talking about trips to Honduras and Guatemala, and perhaps we didn't give the statistic earlier, is that of those 66,000 plus unaccompanied children that have entered in the past year, about over 3/4 of them come from those three countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So we focus a lot on those three countries and those conditions when we try to determine how we can be of assistance. Mary mentioned that Honduras has a #1 murder rate in the world. El Salvador is ranked #4, Guatemala #5. The role that violence is playing in causing some of this migration is critical and important to discuss. I'm happy to introduce Professor Machuca Galvez. He's a professor at Swathmore College, currently the Latin American Studies Coordinator. He was born in Santa Tecla, outside San Salvador in El Salvador. He lived there till the early 1980s. He received his PhD in anthropology from Temple University and has taught at Temple, Pitzer, and Swarthmore College. He currently has, some of his studies are focused on the push and pull factors that lead to migration, and we've asked him to speak to those sort of broader issues regarding the migration of these children. We focus a lot on the moment and sort of what's happening and why these children are coming this year, but the history of that migration is much longer, and we've asked Professor to speak to us a bit about that.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you invited me, and thank you for taking me in. So let me start first by doing some basics on the countries of Central America. The region includes 7 countries: Spanish-speaking Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, and Panama, and English-speaking Belize. These are the original banana republics. And banana republics is not just a brand of clothing, as one of my students told me. No, it's a term apparently coined by US writer O. Henry in the early 1900s to describe the fictional Republic of Anchuria. He was working with Honduras, which is dead, and Anchuria is white, in a book called Cabbages and Kings. So he talked about his experiences in late 1900s in that country. The region is relatively large, 202,000 square miles. It's about 2 Oregons. Okay, just to give you, I don't know how it's in relationship to Pennsylvania, and I'm thinking I should have said Pennsylvania, but it's about the size of 2 Oregons. At the same time, it's so small that on any map in the continent, you only see a little winding outline line between North and South America, just there. Legend has it that when El Salvador declared war to Hitler during the Second World War, he couldn't find it in the map. He said, where is it? The cigars from his, the ashes from his cigar covered the country. Oh, there it is, because it's so tiny that he couldn't find it. In political science, Banana Republic became a pejorative term for a politically unstable country whose economy is largely depending on exporting a limited resource, bananas, coffee, or sugar, what is called dessert economies. It typically has stratified social classes, including a large impoverished working class and a ruling rich class of business, political, and military elites. This politico-economic oligarchy controls the primary sector to exploit the country's economy and responds to foreign corporate interests. In Central America, the United States has had a strong interest in the area and have in a long and often turbulent history dating back to almost 200 years ago. It's not new. These countries have not been by themselves. The United States has been there. The most recent episode took place during the 1980s. Some of you might remember it, some might not, some might have read it in their classes, when during the Reagan administration, the region was the stage for one of the Cold War's last chapter. That was the closing. The origins of the current accompanied children crisis dates back to that era. That these children are here is no coincidence. It's doing by the United States government. I want to emphasize that it's the government policy that one has brought the kids. For a while, every newspaper and media site has stated that Central America has been violent for a long time. That's a given. It appears in the report that you gave me. So violence itself can possibly be the reason that people are fleeing in large numbers now. Over the past decade, the Northern Triangle, that's Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, has earned the not so enviable position as one of the world's most violent and lawless regions in the world. Incidentally, Northern Triangle refers to a series of economic treaties. The area is economically integrated as opposed to the rest of Central America. For the last 4 years, as Stephen mentioned, Honduras has had the dishonor of having the world's highest murder rate. It displays Ciudad Juárez. Very, very dangerous. El Salvador and Guatemala are number 3, and I have number 8. But it might have moved to 5. Mm-hmm. In Honduras, homicides tripled from 2005 to 2012, and its murder rate is at 12 times the international average. So it's no walk in the park to be in that country. It's very, very dangerous. 130,000 Salvadorians were displaced in 2012, just 2 years ago, in a country of 6 million people. And nearly as many people are dying each day as were killed at the height of the Civil War. So it's like the Civil War never really left. This region is more dangerous than a war zone. A civilian is more likely to be murdered in any of these countries than to be killed in Iraq during the height of the insurgency in 2007. Now, one thing, why Nicaragua, which by the way is the safest country right now in Central America, why no children from Nicaragua and why no children from Costa Rica, let alone Panama? Nicaragua experienced what is called south-south migration, and a lot of the kids, if there are kids, a lot of the migrants move to Costa Rica, which has a higher GDP and has offered more opportunities. So people are not, there's no incentive to take this dangerous trip to all these countries, across Mexico, and then get to the United States. So you're not going to hear, I think it's more the exception than the rule, that you're not hear that there are Nicaraguan kids, Costa Rican kids, Panamanian kids. It's from the other 3 countries that appear. Okay, but if Central America was not always that violent, because it was not, how did we get there? How did that happen? In the 1980s, and I could take it even further back. Steve and I were making fun that we can even go further back. But in the 1980s, Central America launched civil wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Battles between United States-supported governments and Marxist insurgents. Flair innovated and then flared again with death squads preemptively squashing potential rebellions. The United States pumped millions of dollars to Guatemala and El Salvador governments, and in Honduras it created training camps, okay. As well as the infamous Nicaraguan Contra. Those were the political actors in the 80s. Over time, millions fled during these grinding conflicts and found asylum in the United States. A lot of Salvadorians, a lot of Guatemalans. 1 in 5 Salvadorian came to reside in the United States. There's no one in El Salvador who can say the Civil War didn't affect me. Everybody has some type of ramification in his or her life. The numbers from Guatemala and Honduras were never quite so dramatic as Salvadorians, though still fairly staggering. There are more than 1 million Guatemalans living in the United States as a result of that conflict. These departures, which were driven by the quest for safety as well as the search for economic opportunity, divided families, weakened the social fabric in these countries, and created conditions for chaos. In this crisis, Salvadorians were considered in the United States many times economic refugees, not political refugees. Why? Because if they were considered as political refugees, de facto there was an acknowledgement that the war created in El Salvador by the United States was kind of not a good thing. So it was better to focus on the economic rather than the political. Cold War ended, Berlin Wall fell, Russia dismembered, boom. United States more or less fled from the region, and it's like nothing happened there. As many cases in the history of the United States, the government is able to eat a whole elephant and don't even belch. Nobody say anything. Okay, the aftermath will come later. The country's appetite for cocaine remained. Honduras, with unguarded coastlines, empty jungles, and convenient location, became a global capital for drug business. Suddenly, the drug cartels, since they couldn't make it through the Caribbean, start eyeing this corridor. That's the ideal area to go through. That implies there will be corruption, that implies there will be a lot of bribery, that implies that there will be a way to control politicians there. Along with these drug factors, gang also became something big. And their growth is, if we're comic, it's not tragic, of the perils of unintended consequences. During the past 2 decades, the United States deported thousands of the Los Angeles gang members back to their birth countries on the Northern Triangle. A lot of Salvadorians who, they were kids, they got to Los Angeles, they were in Pico Union area, had a lot of cultural identity clash with Mexican gangs, started creating their own gangs, then they started to separate from their families. They became, crime, drugs, you name it. And then when they were sent back to El Salvador, to basically El Salvador, introduced hardened criminals and their quasi-tribal customs. There were 2 main groups: the 18th Street Gang, also known as M18, and the Mara Salvatrucha, also known as MS-13. If you see any documentary, I mean, they are presented as the worst of the worst. These are the deadliest people. They use this type of voices in the documentaries. These rival gang members were often dumped with little warning and essentially no program for curbing the impending threat. They just got there. Both groups started vying for control over their own tours in El Salvador. So the war that had happened in Los Angeles, it was now in El Salvador. Governments of Central America weren't prepared for this influx, to say the least. Gangs arrived just as this country were trying to, make it back from the war processes, go back into democracy, a transition that viewed the principle of law and order with skepticism. And by the early 2000s in El Salvador, the growing gang menace became a hot political issue. It was used during the political campaign. The government started then a get tough on crime policy called the mano dura, hard hand. Okay. It was modeled, the basic principle of mano dura was to take out gang members from the street and send them to prison. It was inspired of the zero tolerance model from New York, Mayor Giuliani, but it was taken even further. The government passed an anti-gang law. Thousands were put in jail. They were in prisons, no supervision, no program of reinsertion. What happened? The prisons became finishing schools. From being just gangs, these guys became a sophisticated criminal organization. Enter technology. Cell phones play an important role because then they could control from the inside those who were in prison to the outside, and they were controlling extortion, they were killing, assassinations, you name it. Mano dura then backfired. Okay. Prison time for gang members became this finishing school, as I say. 2 years ago, the State Department estimated that there are at least 100,000 gang members in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the hottest place in El Salvador. In the face of the growth, the Honduran police force has shrunk to 14,000. There's no way that they are going to control the gangs. And to make things worse, in Honduras, the 2009 coup and the chaos that followed, including the haphazard dissolution and reconstruction in government institutions, allow for this swept infiltration in government entities and create even more chaos. That's the source of more. You have to keep in mind that Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala together, again, comparisons, they're about the size of Oregon, that area. So you might imagine a coup created a lot of ramifications and affected neighbors. Then, what's happening then with the gangs, how they operate? Schools are ground zero to recruit new gang members, and teachers to try to protect the school, the students are killed. Today, in the September 15th, there's usually a huge parade in almost every little town in El Salvador. Not in Lolotique, it's a small town near San Miguel, because the gangs say we don't want a parade, and anybody who does it will die. So the clout that these gangs have is really strong. Imagine, I don't know, stopping. I don't think the mummers would be a good example, but they could have that potential. Let's say like, oh no, we don't want the mummers, and if you do it, we're gonna kill you, and they will do it. So there are no real witness protection systems in these countries. So if you witness a crime or you're the victim of a crime, your only choice is to move. If you don't move, you know that you're likely to be targeted long before the case gets to trial, if it even gets investigated. And these cycles of all feed impunity in the region. Eventually people figure out, well, I'm not safe here, even if I move from one place to another. And therefore, who are they going to protect? The children. And then they say, we send you to the States. One line about the children. Doing the trip is dangerous, but it requires a lot of calculations. A coyote is not no one who, works for noble purposes. And I'm going to take you. Hiring a coyote, depending on how much you pay, it can be from $5,000 to $15,000. The more you pay, the safer you are. But having a coyote taking you through that is a peril, because they can steal your money. If you're a woman, you can be raped. Even if you're a man, you can be raped. It requires that people invest, this money. It might be a loan, there might be a collateral. There are all these calculations that not everybody can do it. If you have a relative in the States, it's better. But sometimes it's just, you need to flee. It's flee or you're gonna die. The other thing that is important to remember, they are fleeing not only to the United States. In the United States, we are seeing that there's a lot of kids, but as Steve said earlier, kids are fleeing to Panama, Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, Mexico, and the surrounding countries. When they end up in the U.S. border, they deserve to be protected and cared with assistance that acknowledges that victimization, violence, corruption, and trauma. So they're fleeing. How are we doing with time?
2 minutes.
Okay. Why then, and I want to finish with, why then suddenly we have this so-called crisis? Children have been coming from a long time, at least for 10, 30 years. Unaccompanied minors have been coming here. In the past 2 years, the number have increased. Why then this became a crisis? That's one question that I want to place. How is it suddenly we are hearing it in the news? And if you notice, there's nothing now. I mean, the news cycle is over. It's like, so it's gone? It reminds me this morning of also the crisis in Nigeria with those girls. They made it to the news cycle. Boom, everybody released the girl, and now they're gone, which is very typical of the country. What can be done? But with kids that are here, you have told me that they're here. So is it that it's going down? How can we understand how this phenomenon is moving? And I want to leave it there for the sake of time.
Thank you very much. And I'll just add, we're going to open it up to questions. So those who have been thinking about some questions, please make your way up to the mic, and we'll give some time for a few questions. I just wanted to add one part that we haven't discussed too much is sort of what the government response has been to this influx of children and sort of the situation they're in now. And just in a brief way, I want to say that there have been different responses. Clearly, there are those who respond by saying we should see how we can quickly deport the children as fast as possible, that they should be treated the same as Mexican and Canadian unaccompanied minors. When they come in, they can be removed expeditiously right away without the same protections and opportunity for hearings that children from anywhere else in the world would get when they entered unaccompanied. That's based on a 2008 law that with bipartisan support was passed to protect children who may have been victims of trafficking. So that law exists. So some response has been from Congress is, let's change that law. Let's repeal it and treat all the kids the same by deporting them quickly. Some obviously are fighting to keep the law in effect and hopefully extend it to Mexico and to Canada as well, in the sense that we're talking about children. The majority that have come in recently are definitely the older male teenagers, but the fastest growing group is kids who are 12 years and younger. The children who are being asked to represent themselves in court on their own without guaranteed representation. They should at least have the opportunity to have a hearing, right? So these calls to change the law so they have quick hearings, some of them are asking within 7 days the children should be able to present an asylum case or whatever legal case they have in front of a judge. As attorneys, 7 days, even for us, is not a lot of time to present such a case, and asking children who are not represented to do that makes no sense. I think as a country, and the principles of the country that it claims is that you offer protection to those who are fleeing certain violence, fear of violence, and I think every study has shown that the majority of children are, and the country needs to figure out ways on how to address this. In the 80s, a professor was talking about immigrants coming from Guatemala and El Salvador fleeing wars, applying for asylum, where they had clear claims for asylum, but the US government and US courts refused to grant. Less than 3% of those cases were granted, even though under normal adjudication, they probably should have been granted. And so there was a lawsuit suing, saying there's discrimination against applicants from these countries. There needs to be a movement in a lot of different ways and from a lot of different perspectives on how you help these children, both policy-wise, law-wise, different religious groups and organizations providing care and assistance to the children. So there's a lot of ways people can become involved, and I hope that you do, and that you look at what our organizations are doing and that others are doing in the community to help children. But yes,
yeah, one more thing. There's one principle also that works: out of sight, out of mind. To solve the crisis, the administration has done is exert extreme pressure over Mexico to prevent Central American children from reaching the United States border. So it's like a dam. And there has been an increase in militarization in Mexico. The tension and the possession happened there. So if the crisis is only the fact that the children are in detention centers in the US, attacking, detaining, raiding, and deporting in Mexico solves the crisis. I mean, we don't see them here, fine, it's not a problem. But if the crisis is what happened to these children, simply preventing from arriving in the state, it just makes this invisible to us. It doesn't address the crisis that they are undergoing. So that's, I think, another aspect that we need to consider.
Of course. Questions from the audience? Does anybody want to step up to the mic to ask a question?
Somebody has to be first.
Come on up, sir.
Don't be shy.
That mic?
That mic, yes. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Christian Morsink. I'm with the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia. I have worked with some of the legal people who are doing work in HIAS and trying to help with the children. But it is a legal question and a political question, and I wonder if you guys have been working also with respect to what the United Nations is doing through the High Commission of Refugees. And in the OAS system, is this material being discussed within the OAS?
Well, I mean, so it's certainly, you know, it's difficult because for us, you know, we're dealing with the crisis that we see here at home and in Philadelphia in our communities. And so our biggest challenge is to try to get as much help to as many people right here and right now as we can. And we're seeing, you know, children appearing alone in immigration proceedings, and how can we get them lawyers? I think certainly there's a need to think of it in terms of the bigger picture as far as what's going on in Central America. You know, our agency is not the one who's doing this kind of bigger policy work. To the extent that the work that we do supports that, you know, we're happy to collaborate. I know that the UNHCR, when they went and did their study of these children, you know, by interviewing children who are being detained, you know, they've come up with recommendations for what can be done in these countries, what can be done on a bigger policy level, aside from just, you know, dealing with the crisis that we see here right in front of us. And I think it's definitely something that needs to get addressed.
And if I may add, international organizations have definitely stepped up to say that many of these children could possibly qualify for refugee status. Some discussion, as we've heard, the administration is discussing some immigration administrative policy post-elections now. And there's been some conversation that it may include steps to do in-country processing, refugee processing. So some would argue that the best way is to address the issue is recognize that many of the children are living in conditions of extreme violence, whether in the community because of gangs or in the homes because of abuse, and figure out ways to prevent the journey, the very dangerous journey north, and to process them in country and see if they qualify for status. That's a big step, and it's one that It's not very clear. These are rumors. The administration is definitely not speaking about this publicly, but that's a possibility, and international organizations are trying to do that, push those sort of possibilities and other ways to address this. Others have talked about possibly giving temporary protected status for the minors, which allows the government to say there is a special circumstance, dire situation that people from these countries could get the status temporarily here in the U.S. So there's different possibilities. I don't know about the Organization of American States and sort of what's going on there, but there are definitely a lot of work on international solutions to the issue.
In the Central American countries, at least in Honduras and El Salvador, there's an emphasis not to send the kids, which is, I don't know how well that campaign will work, because it scolds the parents and says, you shouldn't send them, but doesn't give alternatives, like, okay, well, you shouldn't send them, but they're still in risk. So I know the UNICEF has been working on that in Organization for International Migration, trying to prevent that part. That's the extent I know.
So clearly, this is not only a domestic issue at the federal level, it is an international issue, and it's incredibly complex. What can we here in Philadelphia, what can residents of Philadelphia do in order to help the problem? Is it a matter of individuals donating to and contributing financially to the organizations such as HIAS, Esperanza, NSC? Is there an opportunity for individuals to become foster parents, for example, to children that have made the trip? Do we need what kind of legal assistance, or perhaps the recruitment of pro bono attorneys? So how can the average Philadelphian become involved and help the problem?
I would say yes to all of those things. And I would also add that, for the children coming here, it's not just legal needs that they have. I mean, a lot of these children have suffered emotional as well as other damage, both in their home countries, but also in the trip coming over. They may need mental health services. Most of them don't speak English. They need assistance learning English. They also need help. A lot of them, we've had a lot of our clients have had difficulty registering in the schools because the parents also don't speak English. So there's a lot of work that non-attorneys can do to help these individuals. And I know HIAS is working on a lot of projects to get pro bono attorneys involved on the legal issues, but there's a lot of non-legal help that can be done as well.
Thank you.
If I could add two things. A local organization, a new sanctuary movement exists in Philadelphia. It's taking its name from the sanctuary movement that existed in the 80s to really help Central American refugees. When they received orders of removal or deportation, the immigration would come looking for them, and these churches that were involved in the sanctuary movement would house and shelter those individuals in the churches so that immigration could not pick them up. The new sanctuary movement is inspired by that, of course, but there will be a moment where a lot of these children would start receiving orders of deportation. That's going to come soon. They're in proceedings now, and when those orders come, there has to be a decision made by community as whether we believe those are just results, and whether those orders make sense, and what churches and individuals who are interested can do to prevent those deportations. That's one. Another thing that churches and other organizations have been doing as well is visiting detention centers. Not always the easiest thing to do because you need lots of permissions, but Human Rights Watch, for instance, started a monitoring group of immigration detention center years ago, and it's something that can be stepped up, especially in these shelters. A lot of issues as to whether anybody can get into a shelter because of the protection of the children, but at the same time, there are many reports coming out that there is abuse taking place in some of these shelters that's not being reported, and different things are going on and not being well cared for. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. And for the lawyers, I know we need more immigration lawyers to take on these cases, and NSC and HIAS are working to train some, but the need is great beyond that, but even more so family law attorneys as well. Liz mentioned special immigrant juvenile status that exists for children who have been abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both parents. We need family lawyers because you need a family court decision or a dependency court decision order, in order to help those kids. So we need lots of family law attorneys as well.
And if I could just put in another quick plug, in addition to providing, whenever we're providing legal services, oftentimes, especially if we're trying to match a client with a pro bono attorney, we need somebody to do interpretation. So that's one kind of discrete task that anybody who's fluent in Spanish can feel free to volunteer your time to assist us with interpretation during interviews with immigration officers or meetings with attorneys. And then one last thing, because it was mentioned in the question, foster homes. So I'll put in a plug here for an agency called Lutheran Children and Family Services, which provides foster care in some limited cases where there's a child who does not have family members to go to. They will sometimes be placed with foster families, and it can be very difficult, as you can imagine, for these agencies to recruit a foster family that can provide for these children and is willing to provide for these children given their emotional, mental health, and other related needs. Usually they're older teenagers, usually from Central America, usually Spanish speaking. If anybody here is interested in potentially being a foster parent or know someone who may, you can reach out to us and we'll put you in touch with the right people.
And if I may add one more thing, is what you're doing right now, educate yourself. You're learning about, become multipliers, tell other people what's going on. That is more that meet the eyes. There's more in the roots of this crisis that is not over. There's a need for help, so tell others.
And
Hi. Well, this is more than a question. This is more like a comment. Actually, I just came from Guatemala last week. This is my first week in Philadelphia. But something that is really common in Guatemala right now, in the media especially, is that some of another reason for the minors to immigrate to the U.S. is the misinformation from the parents. The parents think that maybe the deferred action or even the DACA itself will provide this legal status for these minors. So it's a comment, but also I just want to ask you, like, if there is any strategy of information, like, not specialized to people in problems, to people that actually prevent this immigration, because there's a lot of that. There's a lot of misinformation. People just think that they can bring the families and they can get this legal status. Thank you.
Coyotes spread the rumor that children, by coming here, they will be, that the immigration reform was imminent. They're very smart, so, and they knew that I cannot remember the name of the law.
DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Yeah, they knew that law, and they knew that unlike Mexican or Canadian children, Central American would not be immediately deported. So that's, I think, an aspect of what you're saying. Right now, there's a lot of effort to neutralize that in the countries. But it's very hard, especially when it's spread by word of mouth. And the Coyote is trying to say, no, don't worry, your kids are going to stay with me. Plus, in the States, they're going to get all these perks. And they will not be sent back, at least for a while.
I've heard some discussion of having the Spanish language media in the United States actually pass on messages to parents who may be living here, who may be the individuals who are funding the trip over, that, this isn't necessarily going to be, a free trip into the U.S., that deferred action for childhood arrivals is not something that new arrivals into the United States could benefit from, to sort of detract from that message.
And there's been some press coverage in El Salvador indicating that the same statement as far are people being misinformed. And some Salvadoran journalists have indicated, we're talking about countries that have decades of migration experience to the U.S., that have family members who have been here for a long time. There's a lot of knowledge of what the immigration laws actually are. So it's not always a case of misinformation. There's also reunification of families. The immigration law has toughened up since 1996, and families have been separated for a very long time. It's hard for parents to travel in and out of the U.S., and so they're here, been separated from their children for a long time, and those kids often want to be reunited with family. We're running out of time, so I'd really like to thank our panelists very much. Thank you for a great presentation, and I hope that this has given you a broad perspective on this issue. It can be, again, addressed from lots of different angles, and we thank you for your participation.